Old Testament, which will be cool. And so today we'll do sort of like a slow little intro before we jump into all of the other stuff. Why did this, first off, I didn't even write this properly. Oh, is my thing doing, nope. I think it's doing the thing where it corrects my writing. No, cool. So we're doing a little bit of an intro. Let me rewrite this over here. So for the sake of notes, we will be talking about how do you pronounce it, Pastor Patrick?
Pentateuch.
Pentateuch. I think it is adjusting my writing. Yeah, what the heck? That's so creepy. Does anyone want to turn that off? Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Guys, that was so scary. I kept telling myself there's no way. And I keep looking down and I felt like I was gaslighting myself. Oh my gosh. Let's try again. And so we'll do this. We'll finish up the summer with this because then in the fall we have to jump back into some of our foundational things. So we'll just have a fun few weeks here in this class. So the Torah, the Pentateuch, is the first 5 books of the Bible. Does anyone know the first 5 off of the top of their head? Huh? What? No, the first 5 books of the Bible, Old Testament.
Old Testament.
Genesis. All right. Wait. Let's do one at a time. Genesis. Next is Exodus. What else? I can never spell Leviticus properly. Leviticus. Then we have Numbers. And finally we have Deuteronomy. Nice. These make up the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which is really cool. This is like the beginning of what we sort of believe when we start doing Bible reading. The cool thing to understand is that the Torah can be translated. It's translated in 2 ways. And I think I realized that depending on how you approach it, you might arrive at 2 very different conclusions. If you render it through the Greek, you will translate Torah as the law, which is not wrong. That's not a wrong thing to do. But if you translate it through the Hebrew thing, you'd end up getting closer to instruction or teaching. Instruction or teaching. So the first 5 books of the Bible are where we get some instruction. We are taught some very basic things. Which is good. I don't remember, Pastor Patrick, why do we call it the Pentateuch again? What is the TLDR there, the short summary?
The 5 books.
That's really what it means, right?
Like Penta. The first 5 books.
5 books.
Yeah.
Awesome. So easy to remember.
Yeah.
Now, the cool thing is depending on how you've grown up in church, you might read those first 5 books of the Bible in a different way. The first 5 are often referred to as like this series of just laws and rules, which is kind of true, but not entirely true, okay? So structurally, the format of these 5 is that it's not just a bunch of rules. There's a story. There's a full story that we get through these books of the Bible. We go through the creation of man. We go through the fall of man. We go through the flood. We go through the patriarchs. We go through the Exodus, the journey, the wilderness, the covenant, with moments of law interwoven between all these details. So if you read these first 5 and you think, well, they're all just rules and regulations, you're missing out on a ton of story. It's actually both. There's a lot of story narrative aspects, and there's a lot of law and rule aspects are just mixed in together. Some of these books are more narrative. Some of these books are much more rules and law driven, which is okay. The important thing to understand about these first 5 books of the Bible, and part of why I think it's important that we spend time in these 5 books, is that when you read all 5 of these together, the first thing these books do is they tell you who God is, and only after you know who God is, do you then begin to understand what to do. which is important. This is a good system to understand, because a lot of times you read the Old Testament and it feels like all of it is rules about do this, don't do this, don't do this, speak this way. That is factual. But the first primary purpose of the first 5 is to let you know who God is and what he's done. You're starting to learn and come up to speed with, this is the creation account. This is how he got the people out of Egypt. And part of what you begin to recognize is that even the rules and regulations that are coming out, they're only coming after God has redeemed Israel out of Egypt. And so we're seeing that first he's taking care of freeing his people. And once they are freed, he starts to give them some rules and regulations to make sense of. And so there's a few ideas as to why I think that this matters today. Reasons why I believe we should still read these and consider these 5 books of the Bible. Reasons to read. I'm going to overly summarize them here, but I'll give you some quick explanations. The first is that it's the foundation. It's the foundation of the whole Bible story. Everything that comes after this, right? The prophets, the writings, the Gospels, all of those things are referencing what happens in the Torah. Even when Jesus comes, Jesus isn't coming to replace the story. He's coming at the end of the culmination of what they believed the Messiah was going to do. And you really can't understand what Jesus is doing in the Gospels if you don't have a pretty decent grasp on what's happening in these books over here. Because he's constantly referencing this. He's constantly going back to this. The people that he's in conversations with and disagreements with are living off of rules and regulations that were given to them here. So it's quite important that if you want to understand the fullness of the Bible, you need to understand these first 5 books of the Bible. The second is that it, and I'm going to use this word very loosely, so please, it shapes the character of God. Shapes the character of God. And let me explain, because I don't want to say anything that's heretical. When you read through the Old Testament and you read through how the authors reference God, you start to build a pretty good understanding of who God is, right? One of my favorite verses is in Exodus 34:6-7. It says that God is compassionate and gracious. He is slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. They reference that repeatedly in the Bible over and over and over, specifically in the Old Testament. That is something that you get to see in the Torah and you get to see in the New Testament as well. So when you start to learn who is God, you get a lot of these characteristic moments from the Torah, which is really beautiful. A lot of times when we talk about God's attributes, we're pulling references from these first 5 books of the Bible. So it's important to know that it begins to give us an understanding. In here, you start to get the understanding of the covenants, the understanding of identity, and the understanding of vocation. Let me just read what it says here, because I don't want to remove this quote that I got online. It said, Israel's calling to be a kingdom of priests, a people who mediate God's presence to the nations, is the theological seed of the church's vocation. N.T. Wright leans on this a lot. He says the church inherits Israel's purpose, not just its promises. So you get to understand the promise that God has to Israel, the identity that that group of people get in relation to who God is, and what God wanted them to do. We as a church, we're inheriting the purposes. We have to keep those things going, even if the promises that God gives to that specific group of people in the Old Testament are not the same group of people that we are today. 4, it raises many questions. Many questions. What I love about when you get into the Old Testament is that you are going to have to wrestle with things. You're going to have to wrestle with conversations that you may not have been ready to wrestle with. Let me give you a silly one. Why do we keep some commands and not all commands? What do we do with the commands that we don't keep? The dietary ones, the sacrificing ones, the civil penalties. There's a tension, I think, when you walk into our faith and you start reading the Old Testament and you read all the laws that were given to these people, and you have to start to say, well, what applies to us and what doesn't apply to us? It's the reason why you start to have some discourses the longer you get into Christianity. The funniest one, I think, is the tattoo one, where people go, well, in the Old Testament, it says don't get tattoos. Well, what does that mean for us today? In the Old Testament, it says not to eat certain things, but let me tell you, you let me loose in a Red Lobster and I'm eating shrimp. You know what I mean? Like I'm a menace in those things. So we do have to wrestle with those questions, because oftentimes you'll be referenced things in the Old Testament, and part of the conversation we have to have is, what rules still apply to us today and which were meant for that group of people at that time. For example, when you get to the 10 Commandments, the idea of honoring your mom and dad, we should probably still do that. Not murdering people, we should probably still do that. Do we drag people out to the street to stone them? Not anymore, So we have those things that we have to make sense of. And that becomes easier the more you read these things, but it's still important to know them and to wrestle with the tension of them. And in many cases, learn to be thankful that we don't operate in the system, because it would be horrible. We'd have to kill animals all the time, and people would be getting stoned all the time, and it would be messy. There's at least one part of this that when you read through the Old Testament, you feel almost a sense of relief that this is not the system that we belong to anymore. And then finally, and this is important, it is formational, not just informational. So when you read through these 5, you're not just ingesting information. It is actually molding you, and it's teaching you how to live. There's wisdom in there. There's practical things in there. You are becoming formed to the sort of person that God wants you to be when you read this, as you also are becoming informed about these things. The Torah was interesting because it was meant to be read aloud and shared and repeated. It was taught to children from a very young age, which means that from a very young age, these people were being formed and molded in the understanding of the Torah. So it's not just rules and regulations, it's a way of living, and it's a way in which these people lived. For us, it's really cool because it allows us to understand that we, as God's church today, there is a way that we should be living. And it's not directly related to how they were living in the Old Testament, but there are a ton of parallels in there. And so before I jump into any of the other things, are there any questions on this so far? I know some of you walked in later. This is just the first 5 books of the Bible. Boom, boom, boom. Yes?
I know it's just a thought in my head.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Old Testament talking about foods that we eat, etc. But in the New Testament, it also speaks the same, has the same content about swine.
Yeah.
So, what is your thoughts on that? Because it hasn't changed from the Old Testament to the New Testament.
Yeah. So when you get in the Old Testament, what we have is, and Pastor Patrick, you might have to help me step in here for a second so I don't sidetrack myself. So there are rules here, right? These are rules for the Israel Jewish people, right?
Yep.
Cool. So when you get to the New Testament, I'm going to make up the Pharisees and the religious leaders, I spelled that wrong, didn't I? Yep. Are still referencing these rules, and they're referencing these things here. When you get to some of the things that Jesus says, and also when you get to some of the things that Paul says, they start to discourse the idea that it's not that these rules are necessarily wrong or bad, but the reason for the rules have sort of shifted a little bit. So we don't follow the rules and the regulations to stay in good graces with God. Jesus has come, lived, died, resurrected. He is the reason that we're able to live the way that we live. And although there's a lot of good wisdom in these rules, they're not necessarily rules that we have to maintain for the rest of our lives so diligently. The other aspect that gets interesting is when Gentiles, non-Jewish people, start converting, they have no point of reference for these rules. So they live their whole life doing things that they had no idea that they couldn't be doing. And Paul has some moments into which the understanding, and again, please correct me because I'm gonna oversimplify. It's the, how do I say it? Do you remember this is so funny. I've always wanted to preach on this topic, but people get really weird about it. But there's this whole long debate on circumcision in the New Testament, because there's this idea of well, Gentiles are coming in. The law tells us we should circumcise them. What do we do? And so there's this back and forth discourse because it's a real issue, which sounds silly to us, but imagine being a guy who just came into the faith as an adult, and they're looking at you and they're saying, if you really believe, we're going to have to do some, that's a very scary place to be in. And part of the discourse is that they start talking about what the Gentiles have seen, what they're doing, how God's moving in them, and they come to the realization that circumcision is no longer a thing that's needed to be in covenant with God. We are already in covenant with God through the person of Jesus. And so there are certain rules, like the whole eating of the swine and stuff like that, that I think there's some people who, even to today, would still uphold those rules. But that conversation is a little bit different when you talk about things like I have heard Christian people say, well, I don't eat swine because of what the New Testament says. But I've never heard anyone say I don't eat shrimp because of what the Old Testament says. And so I think it's the same thing where a lot of these rules you could keep following as long as you understand that these rules aren't what's keeping you in good graces with God, if that makes sense. So if you're like, you know what, I just don't want to eat pork, that's fine. You don't have to eat pork ever again. It's the reason why like the easier example to use is alcohol, for example. There are some Christians who are like, I will never touch it. And there's some Christians who are like, I enjoy my glass of wine. Both are good as long as they understand that neither one of those things makes you closer to God. So if you're sitting here and saying, well, I don't eat pork because God doesn't want me to eat pork, well, that's not entirely true. But if you feel deep conviction to say, I just don't want to eat pork, it's perfect. That's really good. I have two really great ministry friends. One of them is a really amazing pastor, preacher, theologian. And he has a really incredible collection of wine, and he just likes to collect it and enjoys a glass. I have another friend who's a really good preacher theologian. He has never touched alcohol a day in his life. Both of them are incredible, living with two different convictions. Neither one of them is wrong or right. They just have different reasons as to why they do or don't do what they do. But the important thing is the guy who drinks wine doesn't think that makes him holier, and the guy who doesn't drink anything also doesn't think that makes him any holier, So we have to wrestle with those things. Like, yes, the whole clean and unclean part is very relevant. We still see that in the New Testament when they talk about swine and why there's certain things. But if I'm going to oversimplify it for today, those aren't the same. The reason why we wouldn't eat them aren't the same as why they wouldn't eat them back then, because there was a bunch of ceremonial things that had to be done. Today, everything we eat is kind of tainted already by how bad. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But again, I will destroy bacon, egg, and cheese. You know what I mean? Like that is a real good thing that I will do. Now, do we? Yeah, please.
That one. Well, the purpose why God gave the laws was to give also Israel, because He redeemed them out of slavery. So He wanted to establish for them a national identity, a moral identity, and then a religious identity to separate them as distinct from the pagan nations. Like He needed to preserve the identity of the Jewish nation all the way up to the New Testament, because it's through the Jewish nation that we would get the written word and the living word. That's why it was so important for the Jews to forsake the pagan practices, the marriage, because ultimately prophets are going to be told of Jesus Christ from the Old Testament that foretell His coming. Like in the Jewish nation, they just partook in whatever the pagans were involved with. It would be difficult to identify the Messiah. Pastor Mel made two charts, right, or a graph. Old Testament it tells about the history of the Jewish people, but the salvific reason also for the Old Testament is foundational, because later on God's redemptive plan would extend to the whole world, the Gentiles, not just the Jews.
So feel free to eat pork or not eat pork. You know what I mean?
It's so clear that if you look at the Old Testament and New Testament, and yes, we know that salvation through Jesus Christ. It's just very difficult, because like you said, everything is changing.
Yep.
So sometimes I say to myself, going back to the Old Testament, that the way our bodies are designed, I kind of feel like we were made like from the dirt, right?
Sure.
So the way our bodies are designed is to be able to sustain ourselves over the earth. Meaning, He gave us everything we needed to live, and anything that grows from the earth is intended for our bodies to be able to. Everything is just modified, and our bodies are naturally made to digest.
Yeah.
That's why we're having all of these health concerns, etc. That's another reason why I'm saying I almost feel like Old Testament, New Testament, we need another.
Yeah. So there are two thoughts there, and then we'll jump into the charts. One, the funny. So I love very niche passages. I think I've mentioned like I go down rabbit holes of like one sentence will set me off for a month. What's funny is you see that there's a moment after God floods the earth where He tells Moses, from this moment forward, all of the animals of the land are good to eat. So you go, do you mean that before this, no one was eating animals? Yeah, no one was eating animals. So when you read anything pre the flood, people were vegetarian. They just were eating these things. So there's a bunch of different ways to rationalize that. I like to make the joke of like God floods the earth and then he says have steak. Like that is like the balance of what he does. But the reality is like if you're talking about there is a subsection of Christian people who really believe that like in the garden, because we were just eating fruits and veggies, we should only eat fruits and veggies. And that's super fair. That's an entirely fair thing. There's nothing that's saying that we can't eat meat, but the understanding seems to be what you're saying, like we were birthed out of this dirt and in the garden we existed just on fruits and vegetables. Now, with that, things have changed, time has changed. There's a bunch of different farming and agricultural practices. And there's an interesting thing because to read where it's like, yes, things have changed a lot. Like things have been modified. We've put things in our body that we were never meant to put into our bodies. The upside is that in some cases, it has extended our lifespan quite far. You read about the introduction of like basic medicine and you go, oh my God, people used to die in their 30s all the time. And now things get bigger down the road. But those are things you have to wrestle with, the idea of like, is something like a Tylenol necessarily evil? No. But I really love when I have a headache that I can take this thing and it goes away. And people in the Bible have no point of reference for that. So you have to, reconcile those things. So I'm with you on that because we live in an interesting world where it's like lifespan-wise, medicine and even like, again, preservatives aren't great for food. But in situations or places where you can't get fresh food, a lot of people survive on preserved food. So you go, well, it's cool that we have those things that can happen. So like we always have to wrestle with the tension of those things of like in a perfect world, we're still in the garden. But if you live in the middle of like the desert where there's no if you live in the middle of the desert where there's no fresh produce, you are quite thankful that you can get canned beans. You know what I mean? So that's like the balance that we have to live in. Ideally, we all move to a farm, and that's basically like the goal.
That's what
Yes, but I love Taco Bell, so it's like this whole explosive diarrhea thing has been very tough for me because I can't go there, but I love it there. You know what I mean? Okay, so I built an oversimple chart, similar to what we did with the Gospels. This is overly simplified. So this is not like perfect. We're just going to summarize this very, very, very simply. Now, let's start with Genesis. Genesis, who do we think the author is in Genesis? Traditionally viewed as Moses. Yeah. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to spoil something for you. All of them are traditionally Moses. We think Moses handled the bulk of all of them. There are some additional thoughts about like there are eyewitnesses and participants that could have helped, but for the sake of like all 5 of these are attributed traditionally to Moses being the guy. The setting that we're seeing in the book, not the setting of when it was written, I'm saying the setting that the book covers is creation. So we see the creation account all the way to Joseph's death in Egypt. So that's a pretty good span of time. There's a lot of stuff that's being put into that place. We're seeing a long historical narrative throughout the book of Genesis, which is really good. It covers a long span of things. In terms of the content mix, there's a guy online who does a really good job of splitting the details. He says that in Genesis, the narrative content is about 95%, and the law content is about 5%, which is to say, a majority of Genesis is story. It's story. It's telling you what's happening. It's telling you the journey of these people. It's telling you about Moses. You're reading about Genesis is a weird one. If you've not read through it, there's all sorts of weird historical things in there. But it's a mostly narrative book. You're mostly reading for the sake of story, which is really good. The purpose, I don't even know if I have enough space in the box. I made the box way too small here. The purpose is really to establish origin, gives you an understanding of the creation, the fall, God's covenant, the promises that he gives to Abraham. That is a big one. The whole Abraham lineage starts in Genesis, the idea that we are all birthed through this long-standing family tree, which is really good. That begins in Genesis, and you see it all throughout the Bible, constantly referencing it. And then what it does from a thematic purpose, it gives you what we would call, it sets up the problem, which is sin, enters the world, the exile from Eden, and then it establishes that there is a plan that through the lineage of Abraham, we will eventually see salvation, which is really cool. So right from the beginning, we're told everything is bad. This is why everything is bad. I'm going to make a promise to this group of people. A majority of Genesis is interweaving that group of people's story. And the idea is that from that group of people, there's going to be a savior. You're getting all of that in the beginning of Genesis, which is really, really great. Any miscellaneous questions about Genesis? That feels like a crazy thing to ask because there's a ton of miscellaneous, but any questions about the book of Genesis? We're going to go through it in more detail, but any initial thoughts or questions? Perfect. No one. Amazing. You guys are the best.
For now.
For now. For now. The next few weeks are going to be rough. Exodus. Yeah. Author. Moses. Wow. Way to go, guys. No one said anything. Okay. From here, we're covering, and I know that this is going to be a little debated. We're getting from Egypt all the way to Mount Sinai, which is a pretty significant part. Mount Sinai is a pretty big deal in the Old Testament, but that's about the span of what we're seeing in Exodus. When it comes to the split, this one's actually really interesting because what we're seeing, it's about a 50-50. 50% of Exodus is like some rules, some regulations, some things, some instruction. 50% of it is storytelling, which is good. Exodus is a fun one, but Exodus is also kind of rough. The whole narrative of Egypt and the whole Exodus, this journey, you see the Israelites make a ton of mistakes over and over and over. And if you read through the Exodus and you say, man, these people are dumb for making so many mistakes, the Exodus is like a parallel for your life because you're also dumb and you also make a ton of mistakes, which is the beauty. That's why I enjoy reading Exodus so much, because you go, oh my God, these people repeatedly turn away from God. They're so dumb. We do the same thing. It's this beautiful overlay. I don't remember. I don't think it was N.T. Wright. I think it was Rabbi Zacharias, which obviously we're not going to get into our discourse on Rabbi. But I think he said that the Exodus is a parallel for the life of a believer. When you look at the Exodus and the journey, it's similar to the journey that we experience as people. God guides us through the wilderness. He provides for us. We turn away from him. He provides for us again. We turn away from him. So this is a beautiful story. You should read Exodus and not be like, these people are dumb. You should be able to find sympathy with these people and say, I am experiencing my own sort of Exodus in life too. The main themes that we get in the Exodus are the redemption and the freedom. Redemption from slavery. God saves his people. He pulls them out of a bad place. There is a covenant that we see at Mount Sinai, this promise that he gives to this group of people. And then we begin to see some instructions on how to live as God's people, which is really cool. We start to see that now that we've established in all of Genesis, the beginning of Exodus, who God is and what he's done and how faithful he's been to this group of people, now we start to get into the instructions. I think this is good to know because God is not like from the beginning saying, do all these things. He shows himself to this people repeatedly. And I would think that if you have this God who takes care of you in the middle of nowhere for a long time, at a certain point, you'd kind of want to start doing what he says. You would want to take instruction from the God who does all these things. Now, you might be saying it's not that easy. I mean, there was like fire coming from the sky. You know what I mean? Like I would do whatever God told me to do if that was the dynamic I was in. And then what we see here that's really important, a theme that's very big, is that redemption, the redemption of the people comes before the law, which is to say, Israel is rescued and then is commanded, which for us is a really good thing that, like, really think about this. When people give their life to Jesus and they are redeemed, first they are redeemed, and then we begin to instruct them, which is pretty basic, you would think. But I think we forget sometimes that someone who's walking into this for the first time has no point of reference. There's a beautiful sort of parallel here to say that when we give our lives to Jesus, first he takes care of saving us, then we start working on what it looks like to change our lives. So that's a pretty good one. That is the Exodus.
Pastor Mariano.
Yes.
When we get to Exodus, I have photos of all the pharaohs.
Of what?
The pharaohs of the Exodus.
Really?
Yeah, I do.
Wait, why? From where?
Because we found their bodies.
Shoot, that's
so in my
exciting.
study of archaeology, I have to have those files.
I'm curious about that. Who wrote Leviticus? Moses. You guys are not following. Okay. So most of the setting is Sinai. It's about, from what I understand, about 1 month content in the book of Leviticus. It's taken over the course of 1 month. There's really no movement. No one's really moving around. This is not like a big narrative thing, which is why when you read through Leviticus, narrative, they're saying it's less than 10%. And a majority of Leviticus is law. It's really a ton of rules. When you read about Levitical law, this is what we're often referencing. All of the rules and all of the regulations are in here. Now, a majority of the rules and the regulations are priestly and sacrificial, which means we don't have a lot of use for a lot of these because we are not this divine priesthood in the sense of the Old Testament word. We're also not doing sacrifices, And it essentially gives a set of rules that explains how God can be amongst unholy people. How does a super holy God interact with a very unholy people? By giving these priestly rules and sacrificial law to say, if you want to interact with me, the holiest of holy, this is what you have to do to be able to be in my presence. So it's a really interesting book. Can I speak as a human for 2 seconds, not as a pastor? Very boring. Reading through this one's rough. Like, I'm not going to lie to you. I've never heard someone be like, this is my favorite book of the Bible. You're a psychopath if you think this. It's a very grindy book. But the Bible can't all be story. You know what I mean? There has to be this part where we're understanding these things. Further on down the road, for you guys who were here last week when I spoke, right? There's a moment when the lady is going to get stoned. I cross-referenced what happened in Leviticus. You start to see how this works. For you to make sense of the stories in the Old New Testament, you have to be able to point back and dig out these laws in Leviticus. The cool thing is, I would say almost every single time in the Bible, in the New Testament, where it says, and this is what the law says, you can find every single one of those things in Leviticus or in Deuteronomy. So it's a really, really cool moment. And thematically, statistically, it's the most skipped book. There's one of these pastoring sites I subscribe to, and they have this thing where pastorally what a lot of these guys do is they upload their sermons in there. So it becomes an archive of preaching. And they have something like 100,000 plus sermons. Leviticus is used the least in any of those sermons. It's just not a reference. It's a very, very small thing. And I think it's because it's mostly used as a cross-reference for us. Similar to last week, I touched on Levitical law. I didn't preach a whole sermon on it, but I used it as a reference point. It skipped a lot. And yet, what's really interesting, it's the most quoted by Hebrews. It's referenced a ton. There's a lot of what Tim Mackey calls hyperlinks. There's moments where in the book of Hebrews, things are referenced that directly point back to Levitical law. So again, as you begin to read more, you can read Hebrews today, have no point of reference for Leviticus. You get a really good understanding out of the book of Hebrews. You go back to read Leviticus, and then you go to read Hebrews again, and your brain's going to start connecting some dots there. It's this really beautiful thing. And so, am I telling you to go read Levitical law? No, but it's good to have as like a reference point. Go and dig into it if you can. You're going to walk out with a bunch of things. You will fall asleep, but it's a good thing to have in your pocket. Make sure you read that. Numbers. Woo! What do you guys think Numbers is about? Numbers. Awesome. Great. Probably it's the second most skipped. Yeah. So Numbers is interesting because it talks a little bit. It starts in like the wilderness when they are wandering, and it gets you to the plains of Moab, which is about a 40-year sort of gap there, which is cool. Content mix-wise, this is another one of those fun ones. In terms of narrative, we're talking about 60%. A lot of it is like story, but there is a lot of law in there as well. One of the major themes here is that there's a lot of records, genuine records. There's whatchamacallit, there's a lot of documentation that happens in the book of Numbers, and it shows really, if we're talking about like the big transitional point, there's this moment where you see the new generation that is ready to enter the promised land. If you don't know the story, there is a promised land that is where these people are wandering through in the wilderness. And the generation that is promised the promised land never gets to actually get into the promised land. There's a whole historical teaching in there as to why that is the case. But in the book of Numbers, what we see is the new generation that is going to walk in, which is really cool. And this is where you start getting a lot of the discourse. If you grew up in the very Pentecostal upbringing like I did, there's like the old generation, the new generation, and God's raising up a new generation to enter the promised land. That's the whole sort of gist of this, which is really good. And in terms of where this is referenced, Paul actually has two moments where he very heavily cross-references Numbers. That is in 1 Corinthians 10. And not that this is super important to you guys, but Hebrews 3 and 4. Both of these are like directly leaning on the content of the book of Numbers, which is good. So again, even though it's not like the most exciting book, it's doing a lot of cross-referencing for books in the New Testament that are quite dense. Paul's letters are very theologically rich. The fact that he's referencing these books is super important. And then our final little book in the Pentateuch is Deuteronomy. Guys, it took me so long to learn how to spell this one. And I still gaslight myself. Deuteronomy. What? Yes. Ha-ha. I'm amazing. Okay, so this goes from the plains of Moab to the threshold of the promised land. A lot of these really are like, I don't know if you realize, like this is the journey that's happening here. We're seeing like this long, that's the wrong color. We're seeing like this long, slow journey where throughout the course of these books, we're seeing the people move. They're moving somewhere. Historically, they're making progress. And along the way, as they're moving, God is instilling laws over them, which again, it's important. That's a reason why we think that this is such an important book to read. In terms of the split, we have a really fun split here. I want my purple back. It is about 20% narrative and about 80% rules, regulations, and stuff like that, which makes sense for this. The cool thing here, the big thing, is we're seeing a covenant renewal for new generation. One of the big things is that there is this understanding. It's like, how do I say this? The new generation is learning to live with the promises and the rules and regulations of the old generation, with the understanding that they are inheriting a system that they were not really present for, and learning how to live with that. There is this beautiful poetic moment where God, who spoke to Abraham and his people, is sort of reconnecting with this brand new group of people and is instilling the idea that I was God to them and I'm also God to you, which is a really cool thing. It's very powerful because you have to think about it. We don't have a lot of point of reference here, but imagine what happens when like a church transitions over, right? There's something that happens in the shift of the new generation and the old generation where you're coming to the understanding that we're in the same journey, even though the generations are very different. So you have this new group of people who have the stories of what happened in the past, and they're trying to make sense of how to live with this God while understanding that these rules and regulations weren't theirs, but they have to keep upholding them and living with them. It's really interesting. There's a big tension point here. It's almost as if you're being inherited a job and they're telling you this is how you have to do everything. And you're saying, but why? And you're like, this is just it. This is the promise to that person. You get to keep living in that promise. I've always found this interesting because I don't like rules. And so seeing that these people have to live with a set of rules that weren't really given to them, but they still have to honor and keep them, for me is very fascinating. There's a lot of tension when you see these things. You start to see post-Deuteronomy, the struggle that this group of people have with those rules and how those rules become very loosey-goosey over the course of the next few hundred years. They consistently begin to mess up. But again, you have to remember, they weren't a part of the generation that were like taken out. They weren't there when God did all these miraculous things early on. And so they only know the stories, and they're referencing things that they've heard and things that they've been taught. So it's a really interesting thing for me. My brain sort of like loves this thing. And here in the like major themes, we get, Pastor Patrick, if you can give a quick summary of the Shema as I keep writing, please.
Hear, O Israel, God is one. Deuteronomy 6:4, right?
Yeah, if you just want to give a quick brief to the class, because I really want to write this down.
You want me to read it?
Oh, yeah. Do you have it with you?
Yeah, I can pull it up. It's easy. Deuteronomy 6:4, which says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So this is referenced by the Lord Jesus Christ as well, reiterated as the greatest of all commandments.
Yeah, it's quite significant. Do the Jewish people still pray that like every? Yeah, that's what I thought. It's a very referenced thing. And then Jesus quotes Deuteronomy a lot. Jesus quotes it the most all the time. When he's quoting things, he's quoting Deuteronomy. Oftentimes, he's not just quoting directly, but when he's referencing something, he's mostly referencing Deuteronomy. Now, does this mean that this is like the most significant of the five? I wouldn't say most significant, but I would say it's one of the ones that carries the most cross-references. If you're going to say, like, I really want to understand Jesus, you have to have a good understanding of Deuteronomy because he's constantly pointing back to it. He also is, this is the when he's quoting against Satan in the wilderness, he's referencing these moments here too. And so Deuteronomy is a really important book. It's really significant. Not that it's more significant than any of the other ones, but practically in like my preaching and teaching, whenever I'm digging through Jesus, almost every sermon I'm referencing back into Deuteronomy something because he's constantly pointing back. Which is cool to know that like we know, Jesus didn't come to nullify the law, he came to fulfill it. And in that, he often references the very things that he came to fulfill and came to complete, which is really cool. So this is sort of a very rough chart. This is sort of what we see happening in the Old Testament. And not the Old Testament, in the Torah, the first five. And for us, this is what the Jewish people use. They reference the Torah. This is like their main reading because it is the story of their people. This is the story of how God was faithful and carried them and drove them out of the wilderness and freed them and restored them and made a covenant with them and the promises and the rules and the regulations. Now, one of the interesting parts about this specifically, and again, please, one thing you need to understand about me, I'm not in the business of trash talking other religions. I don't enjoy that at all. But what I do want to do is poke at certain things. And I think one of the interesting parts that we're seeing is there are a lot of Jewish people who try to live under some of these rules, but they've had to adapt the rules to modern times. And I think that's part of even the discourse of what we were saying before of the pork. It's just funny because you realize that these rules were made for a time that we don't live in. And so it's very hard to really satisfy a lot of these laws and regulations. There's that one thing in New York, I watched a video on it a few weeks ago where there's like a walking radius that they can leave on the Sabbath. There's a certain amount of distance you can leave from your home. Do you remember, Pastor, is it about like a mile in traditional like Jewish culture?
I'm not sure, but it's short.
It's something like short. It should be enough to get you to the temple and back from the temple or something like that. Which is why if you're in any town where you see a Jewish population, they're all so close to the temple because they quite literally have to attend and they're given a certain amount of walking distance on that day. Which is really fascinating. There's a lot to unpack there. That's why like people are funny because they're like, why do they all live together? Because they have to. Because there's a rule that they have to be in walking proximity. But in New York City, that becomes a little bit harder. New York City is weird. So they have like these maps that they've drawn in the city where they, again, I'm going to slaughter this, so please read into it because it'll be fun. The rabbis have said, well, this distance goes longer than the mileage, but as long as you're within the zone, it's fine. And from one perspective, you go, that's quite practical because it's New York City. From another perspective, you go, they just bypassed the rules. They just created a new set of rules on their, and you start to see how like, it's hard because to be able to fully live these things out, you're conceding a lot. You're making a lot of adjustments, right? In a setting where they didn't have microwaves or technology, today, not using microwaves or technology one day of the week, I mean, you're using it the rest of the week. You start to see how like there are some things there. So, not to say that I'm saying like the the rules and the laws are bad. What I'm saying is, in the context in which they were given, they were very easy to adhere to because culturally that's what was going on. That's not the culture that we live in today. Things have changed a lot. Back then, whether you were Jewish or non-Jewish, people were killing animals for sacrificial reasons anyway. So it wasn't the weirdest thing, but God gives you ways to kill it. If you're a part of my people, this is how you're going to do it. You can't go kill animals today. You know what I mean? Like, that's just not a normal thing to do. And so you start to see how these things start to get now. Are there some things they try to keep to? Yeah, they're very strict about their fabrics and what they can and can't eat. I did a very long deep dive on like the hats that the Jewish people wear. And first off, they're super expensive, but it's also because they're made a specific way. They're not cross-referencing fabrics. They can only be made by someone who's been blessed to make it. They don't sell that product to non-Jewish people. So you see that they are trying to adhere to some rules, but a lot of these other rules are just not possible to adhere to. So what we do when we read through this is we say, wow, God made a promise to a group of people. He gave them instructions. He gave them rules. He gave them regulations. He say, live this way. If you live this way, the people around you will know that you are my people. That is how they're going to know. We interact with the person of Jesus, and Jesus doesn't nullify that, but there's one Bible part that I enjoy a lot where he says that they will know that you are part of what we believe by how you love one another. So you see how things start to shift. So we're not trying to stand out by these rules and regulations. We are trying to be a part of the family by choosing to let the love of God be inside of us and affect how we love him and how we love the people around us. Us as Christians, we're not identified by these rules and regulations. We're identified by the Jesus that is in us, the Holy Spirit that's inside of us. He empowers us, he convicts us, he leads us, he guides us. Is there wisdom in following a lot of these rules? Absolutely. Some of them are very common sense. Do not murder. That's like a very good one. Don't steal. Don't have affairs. Awesome. But you can't go kill people when they do. You see, that's a tension that we live in. There's a lot of practicality in here, but we don't get to execute things in the same way because we live in a sovereign nation where our nation is not Jewish, and so we don't have those rules and regulations. And even when you get into the New Testament, you see that they had struggles with their laws when they were under Roman opposition, because now they have their religious laws, but then Rome had its own set of legal laws. And so there's always going to be this tension point. So when we read through the Old Testament, what we have to remember, it's a group of people who are on a journey, who are given rules and regulations, and the moment you walk out of these 5 books of the Bible, the story changes drastically. You start to see how they disobey. You start to see how they struggle. You start to see how they forget who God is. They betray him. He calls them back. Things are really good for a bit. And then the cycle repeats over and over and over and over. It's the reason why we have the prophets, because God is sending people to speak on his behalf. It's the reason why we have the kings. It's the reason why we see the whole story of David and how that narrative comes out. We see all of these things happen. But at the beginning of what we believe, God had a plan. God created people. The plan in the garden was ruined by Adam and Eve. He then says, hey, through the lineage of Abraham, we're going to see a savior. And that's sort of what we get to in this oversimplified summary of week 1 of the Old Testament. Any questions? Any big questions for summary week? Some of you guys, your brains are still, I get it, it's fine. You know, like you're good. Just run the red light. Just keep, okay. Any questions, any thoughts, any comments, anything to add? It is a summary week. So again, I would not be surprised if there aren't any. The next few weeks will be more intense. Awesome. You guys are just the smartest class in the world. So one thing I want to explain, because we're going to have this, we're going to keep doing this. It'll probably be about 2 weeks per, similar to the Gospels, probably. I would say two weeks. So this is about 10 weeks of classes that we're walking into. But one thing I want to reference is Pastor Patrick. When do you want to start your class again? The one in August?
I guess so, yes.
Give me the date.
I'll let it right now.
Because I also got to start promoting that. Oh my gosh, 5%. 5%. It's fine. It's fine.
September. Please do August.
Huh?
August 2026.
You want to do August or September?
Either one.
Whatever you want to do. Essentially,
Yeah.
Pastor Patrick will be running a class on Islam and how we, especially if you're family or friends who are Islamic, this is a great class for you. What we're going to have to do over the next few weeks is record this class as well. But what I would say is for a lot of you, it would be very practical to just go attend that class for 4 weeks and then jump back into this one when we go into it. We're going to promote this to the class because there are some people who, I was going to make a really bad joke. I'm going to make the joke. They don't care about like Old Testament stuff, but they are interested in how to talk to their Islamic neighbors. And so I think we're going to see an interesting thing where when we offer that class, we're going to see some people join that class, some people be in this class. They're going to run at the same time, but we'll have the recordings of both, so you can go back and watch them both, which is good. Both are going to be offered, which is nice. This is for your school, right? For
my project for my.
It's a project. So with that being said, if you're going to attend this class, give him the hardest time possible, because we have to really give Pastor Patrick the densest, most stressful few weeks of class. We'll get the date. Double check Pastor Patrick when you want to. It should be in August or September. But again, that's going to be very, very good.
What works for you, Pastor? Doesn't matter.
I don't care. Either one's
Either
fine.
way.
We're going to start some night classes in the fall too, so that'll be a fun back at the church. That's going to be a fun thing.
I'm going to say August 2nd. Or is that too soon? Maybe too soon.
August 2nd. I preach next Sunday, so I can start announcing it publicly.
August 2nd.
August 2nd? Cool. So that's that. So if you have any questions, the group chat on the Church Center app will be updated. I'm going to change it to let people know that the Gospels are there. Oh, I'll announce it today. I'm doing announcements today.
Did you
What?
delete that chart that you made?
Which one?
The chart you filled. Okay. Can you send me a photo of that one minus that? Sorry. Those two circles.
Yeah.
Just send me a picture so I can load it.
Yeah, of course. Now, let me just say this. I will take any moment I can to make fun of him. I love Pastor Nick. If we made him make this chart, it would be like looking at Islamic font. Like, it's insane how bad his handwriting is. So when you see Pastor Nick, say that you're praying for his handwriting. That's going to be our next joke. I'll be like, every week we pray for your... You know how now there's like the new AI thing where you can write notes and it'll transcribe them? Oh my God. We tried with his notes and the system was like, we don't know what language this is. It was beautiful. Beautiful. So pray for our senior pastor. He's also out on vacation. So awesome. We won't be seeing him for like 3 months. 2 weeks. Cool. That's basically it. If you have any questions, we'll be here for the next 2 minutes. Otherwise, you can make your way to service.